Growing up in North Carolina in the 1970s and 80s, every little guy who was out in his driveway playing basketball was putting up the four fingers. He wanted to be a point guard. He wanted to be Phil Ford from Rocky Mount, maybe Monty Tao from NC State, maybe later on Bobby Hurley at Duke. But in 2024-25, it seems like the role of the point guard is more and more diminished, maybe even becoming an endangered species in today's college basketball landscape. Among the six bottom teams in this year's ACC standings, five lack an ACC caliber starting point guard right now, and it's killing them. Among the top seven teams, six, all but Wake, really like their point guard. David Glenn, is the point guard a position that is not as critically important, maybe going the way of, dare I say, what a true five center would be in old-time Carolina basketball mindset?
That's a great philosophical question, and I look forward to Coach Keating's answer because he watches high school basketball, he watches college basketball, and he had to recruit himself, so he may have a better answer to the philosophical question. Right. But as somebody who's watched the 18 ACC teams this year, I find it, beyond mere coincidence that there is that bottom tier with point guard headaches left and right. And there's the top tier where almost everybody loves their point guard. Real quickly, think of it. Clemson has both Chase Hunter, first team All-ACC candidate, and the BC transfer Jaden Zachary. They're kind of sharing point guard duties. Louisville has the guy we just mentioned, Chucky Hepburn. I think he's a first-team All-ACC guy. The Cardinals love their point guard play. UNC has a returning starter in Elliot Cadeau. SMU actually has the Wake Forest transfer, Boopy Miller, who's a very talented player who's fitting the Mustangs system well. Stanford is in that middle-of-the-pack mix in large part because Duke transfer Jalen Blakes is playing by far the best basketball of his college career. A bit player for the Blue Devils. He has become Stanford's second best player as the Cardinals point guard. Maxime Renaud, the big guy, is their best player, but Jalen Blakes is their second best player, had that huge bucket to beat Carolina in the Smith Center, which made all sorts of Duke people smile. Duke is doing it a little differently at point guard. I mean, Cooper Flagg, the 6'9" forward, leads them in assists. But Tyrese Proctor has a little point guard in him. Caleb Foster has a little point guard in him. Con Knippel's a good passer as a wing player. Sion James, the Tulane transfer, is kind of a part-time point guard. Duke's doing it differently, but they can break whatever rules they want because they're so talented. Wake is kind of overcoming its lack of a point guard. But again, the theme is in that top 6 or 7, they either like their point guard or love their point guard. The Demon Deacons are trying to grow with Tyler Johnson into a better version of himself. And I think he's a key, that's sort of that X factor in whether the Deeks get where they want to go, which is the NCAA tournament. But listen to what happened at the bottom of the ACC, guys. Again, this is not mere coincidence. If you have a good to great point guard situation, and then you fumble it for various reasons into a bad point guard situation, we don't have to guess what the results are going to be. It's almost certainly going to be a train wreck. These are the 6 teams in the bottom of the ACC standings right now. Are you ready? Syracuse. You guys remember last year a very talented sophomore named Judah Mintz, okay? A lot of people said, dude, you're not ready for the NBA, but he decided to go anyway. Of course, predictably, he went undrafted. He's now playing in the G League, the AAA of the NBA, if you will. But Syracuse head coach, remember, Adrian Autry, he once was the Syracuse starting point guard way back under Jim Boeheim. This is the school that gave us Pearl Washington at point guard. They gave us Sherman Douglas. They gave us Jerry McNamara. The Orange gave us Johnny Flynn, Michael Carter-Williams, Tyler Ennis, Scoop Jardine. I mean, this is a school famous for great point guard play. Right. And they go from Judah Mintz, who, again, might not have been ready for his NBA jump, but was a very talented college basketball player. What did they do? They ended up kind of in an emergency portal situation, plugging in a guy named Jaquan Carlos. He's a tough kid. I admire him. I respect him. He's a heck of a defender. He's a hard worker. He is simply not a starting caliber ACC point guard. And that is a massive, he was a good player at Hofstra before being signed by Syracuse. That is a massive downgrade from pro prospect Judah Mintz to Jaquan Carlos. And the Orange have one of the worst offensive teams in the entire ACC. This is not mere coincidence. These dots connect to each other. Similarly, bottom third of the ACC standings, right? Bottom 6 out of 18. Virginia Tech lost a guy that I think all of us admired and respected last year. Sean Padula would have been your starting senior point guard. This would have been his 3rd year as the starter for the Virginia Tech Hokies at essentially the quarterback equivalent in college basketball, your point guard, the guy who makes everything else work. Instead, Ole Miss throws a bunch of money at Sean Padula. He's now playing and starting in the SEC for the Rebels. And Mike Young, a coach that I respect the heck out of, made a really bad tactical error with the benefit of hindsight. He decides he's going to sign this really talented Temple transfer named Hasir Miller. Hasir Miller, the problem was part of an FBI investigation into illegal betting activity on Temple Owls basketball games. Now, you roll the dice. You just hope this guy's not involved. But it turns out the FBI wanted more interviews with Hasir Miller. So again, massive downgrade if you're Virginia Tech. Sean Padula, proven veteran point guard starter. Hasir Miller never ended up playing a game for the Hokies. Why? Because the FBI investigation continued. Hasir Miller kept being one of those guys interviewed. I mean, it sounds like a novel, right? I'm not making this stuff up. Virginia Tech not only loses its starting point guard, Sean Padula, to the transfer portal, they lose their incoming star point guard, somebody they thought would be their best player and the table setter that would make all the other pieces work well together. Hokies don't get him either because of that wacko FBI investigation. And who has the worst turnover rate in the ACC? The Virginia Tech Hokies. Position of strength, Sean Padula, becomes a position of great weakness. The assembly of guys they've had there, and your season is essentially derailed as a result of mismanaging personnel at point guard. I'll put NC State to the side because Michael O'Connell was the starter last year. They won the ACC title. They made the Final Four. I'll just add this in the Wolfpack context, since they're in that bottom third of the conference standings. If you have more of a table-setting point guard, and that's okay, you better surround him with really good weapons. Last year, DJ Burns became a heck of a weapon down low. Mohamed Diarra became a heck of a weapon at forward. DJ Horn became a heck of a weapon at wing guard. And this year's Wolfpack simply does not have those same high caliber players for Michael O'Connell to feed. And that's why the same guy who fit well last year simply isn't enough, because he can't set the table with that level of talent around him. Continuing down the line, Miami's a little weird because they are the worst team in the ACC standings. Their starting point guard, Nigel Pack, got hurt. So he hasn't played since early December, and the Hurricane season has absolutely imploded. Jim Larinaga resigned at midseason. They're in dead last place. They sometimes don't even look like they're trying. This is more of an injury issue, but you lose your point guard for 2 months, you're last place in the ACC. Again, these things are not mere coincidence. The other two examples from the bottom of the standings, Boston College. They say there are no trades in college athletics. Okay, Boston College's starting point guard a year ago was Jaden Zachary, but he is now at Clemson. Clemson, one of the Clemson Tigers point guards last year, but he was a backup, was Josh Beadle. Beadle transfers from Clemson to BC, but he's a backup for the Tigers. The Eagles need him as a starter. Never good enough to start at Clemson, but BC plugs him in as the starter. Meanwhile, Jaden Zachary, same position, goes from BC to Clemson. I mean, looks like a trade, sounds like a trade, isn't a trade. It just so happens they play the same position and they switched schools. Well, Zachary was a 3-year starter for the Eagles. The Eagles became an NIT team a year ago, in part because Zachary's a good player. And Quentin Post, now in the pros, was a good big man. Well, you downgrade massively from 3-year starter Jaden Zachary to this Josh Beadle guy who could never crack the starting lineup at Clemson. Massive downgrade at point guard. You go from a solid NIT team to one of the worst teams in the ACC. These things are related. These things are not mere coincidence. The last example is Virginia. I mean, Virginia has won as many regular season ACC titles under Tony Bennett over the last decade plus as anybody, more than anybody. What did they have last year at that vitally important position of point guard? They had future NBA player Reese Beekman, who's now with the Brooklyn Nets of the NBA. He was a two-time defensive player of the year in the ACC. He was all second team all ACC, I think, as a senior a year ago. Position of great strength, obviously, with Reese Beekman running the show at UVA. What do they have this year? Next to nothing at point guard. And their offense, which, a lot of people didn't like their style, but it was often efficient under Tony Bennett. What happened? They actually signed a guy who would have made sense for the Cavaliers. His name's Jalen Warley. He was a multi-year starter at point guard for the Florida State Seminoles. He's more of a defender, a long-armed guy. You could absolutely picture him fitting in really well after the departure of Reese Beekman as this long-armed UVA-style defender on the perimeter. But Tony Bennett, at the last minute, decides to announce his resignation, and Jalen Warley goes at the last minute from UVA's projected starting point guard to I'm not signing with the Cavaliers after all because I don't get to play for that Tony Bennett guy who just surprised me with his resignation. Again, what's the theme here? Bottom six teams: Syracuse, Virginia Tech, Virginia, BC, and Miami, and then the Wolfpack over to the side. You go from a position of strength at point guard to varying degrees to a position of disaster at point guard. I mean, Virginia has one true point guard on its roster, a guy named Day Ames. He's an Iowa State transfer. They were thinking he'd be a reserve. Now they got to ask Isaac McNeely and Andrew Rohde and other guys who aren't really point guards to play point guard because Jalen Warley ends up not signing after all. Who has the dead last ACC offensive numbers this year in many categories? UVA. It is so consistent across the ACC that if you screw up that position, you are asking for trouble. And there's only a few exceptions, again, Wake being one of them. And if you get that position right, you are dealing from a position of strength. Again, there are a few exceptions. But the general rule of thumb is, as with a football quarterback not screwing up a football coach not screwing up his quarterback depth chart, if you are a college basketball coach, as I turn it over to a longtime coach, Coach Keating, you better get your point guard depth chart right, because no matter how good a coach you are, you're not going to make the pieces fit together smoothly when you don't have that trigger man helping you run the show.
I love you reference the depth chart. It's almost like if you have 2 point guards, you're definitely going to have the luxury of having 2 point guards. I grew up in a golden age when I came into this business in the 80s and the 90s. Certainly grew up in the Big East where the point guards, Mark Jackson, Pearl Washington. And I just go back to the ACC and just look at an historical run of point guards where you knew who the point guards were. I mean, this list is not even a list. It's not even comprehensive. By the way, no one is comprehensively breaking down the point guard dilemma in any conference as eloquently and as in-depth as David just did anywhere in the country. I can guarantee you that. When you go back to, let me just throw names at you. You know what these names are going to elicit. Look, Kenny Anderson, Stephon Marbury, Mark Price, Sam Cassell, Charlie Ward. I remember when I was at Wake Forest, we got to play against Charlie Ward. Like, these are true quarterbacks in the sense of having a guy who's also a quarterback. NC State with Sidney Lowe, Chris Corciani, Pearl Washington, Sherman Douglas, Ty Lawson, Kenny Smith, everyone in between at Carolina. Even at Miami, after Shane Larkin, Angel Rodriguez was a point guard for Miami. I think one of those two guys took them to the Final Four. I'll give a Clemson guy because I know David has an affinity for Clemson. Terrell McIntyre, a great point guard in his own right. Like, we don't even have to talk about the Hurleys and the Amakers and the Dawkins. Malcolm Brogdon, who's in the NBA from Virginia. Harold Dean when I was at Virginia or at Wake Forest. And let me go back to that point because there's a guy out in the ether right now as a media member, one of the all-time greatest point guard or guards, I shouldn't even say guards, players in ACC history that I was fortunate enough to come across, that hopefully we'll have a chance to talk and wax a little bit on our past together at Wake Forest, and Randolph Childress. If you ask any of the kids today, because they may know who was a point guard back when Tim Duncan was at Wake Forest, they would say Randolph Childress. You are wrong. Charlie Harrison was our starting point guard in 1993-94 in Tim Duncan's freshman year. Randolph Childress was a de facto two guard, if you will, a scorer in every sense of the word. So to David's point, as a coach, you always viewed the point guard as your coach on the floor. It was your conduit, right? I always wish that we could have microphones like they have in the quarterback's head. I mean, like football guys got it easy. They got a mic linebacker and a quarterback that you can talk to in live action on the field without anyone else hearing you. I mean, what an advantage! What a great crossover!
You
I'd
guys are
love to
always
have.
yelling at the players anyway from the sideline.
Yeah, I mean, like, give me a little technology, throw a little earbud in there, go have Ethan put a little, hidden earpiece in, and just tell him what you want to run, or tell him where to pass the ball. I mean, what a great benefit. But having a point guard, to me, and David mentioned a depth chart of point guard, you wanted to have a backup point guard too. It was the thing that made not only your offense run, but it was the head of the defense. I remember that in the Carolina way when I came across Buzz. And you go back and watch if they were in, 30 or 40 defense. Are we going to trap the ball handler? Are we going to trap the first pass? As soon as you hit the floor, you turn around. We're double fist or open hand fist for the 30 or 40 call. Are we in point zone? Talking about mixing zones in, like Dean Smith and Roy Williams did with the point zone that looked like a 2-3 but was really a 1-3-1 and took some guys years to figure out. Right. So like having a guy on the floor that as a coach you could count on to coach the team. There might be a direct correlation in what we're all seeing now in coaches losing their mind on the sideline because they don't have a guy to keep it together on the court. So they're going through the frustration of just, blowing gaskets on the side because there's no one to keep the reins in hand on the court. It's such a valuable tool. And I don't think there will be any coincidental correlation other than the fact that the best teams that we see at the end of the year, you will know who their de facto point guard is. Duke is the outlier because of their talent, because of the generational talent, as Steve Forbes mentioned after the game, that Cooper Flagg is to be able to play a point forward. But this point guard position has kind of become uncool, if you will. Kids want to develop what they call a bag. They want to go into the bag. They want to score. They want to go deep in the bag. They want to be able to go, all Jamal Crawford on guys and 5 or 6 dribble moves. The ball doesn't move as much. It's very much dribble, dribble, dribble. It's a lot of one-on-one. We referenced earlier on about Wake Forest and that 4-minute stretch against the Duke zone. It shouldn't take a coach on the sideline to run down to the head coach to say, hey, they're in zone. You can figure out if a team's in zone with 1 or 2 cuts or 1 or 2 screens, or just by very simply having the wherewithal as the point guard to look at it and go, oh, wait a minute, Cooper's not guarding Juke over there. Well, they must be in zone. Let's run a zone action, because really, if you do it truly enough, the best man offense is your zone offense. The best zone offense is your man offense, because they both do what you should do to beat each other, right? Now we're all about one-on-one and trying to dribble into eternity and hope to get the ball up. So, I mean, I'd be really interested to also follow as we get closer to the tournament, which teams have the point guard that can really help them execute on both ends. And I'll just end with this, and David brought up and kind of read my mind. Seeing the game in person, seeing Stanford in person at Carolina last week recently with Jalen Blakes, Stanford to me is the one team that if I'm in the ACC right now, I'm a little concerned about. If they go 13-7 with SMU on the schedule twice, with Wake Forest at home, they're at Louisville and at Duke. If they can somehow split the at Louisville, at Duke, not lose any other games below them, and find themselves at 13-7, their numbers are kind of in the neighborhood right now where they can start to get jacked up. Don't be surprised if they don't falter and they beat who they're supposed to. And if they can get SMU twice, that they're not a team that all of a sudden finds himself maybe stealing one of those bubble bids from Carolina or Wake. And probably because they have a guy that they trust that's evolving as a point guard mentality at 5 or 6 assists a game, with a guy in Reynaud that we know can put up 20-10 any night. So the point guard as a coach, invaluable. I can't even, it's a direct correlation between my best teams and the teams that won, the teams that didn't. How good was our point guard? How deep was our point guard roster? How young was it? How experienced was it? I was fortunate enough to play and coach and recruit a handful of great point guards, a lot of which right now are actually coaching in college basketball today. Not a coincidence. So it's obviously one of those things that'll stand out. The kids don't like it because it's not a sexy position, but just like rebounding, traveling, and getting you paid in the NBA, I have a suspicion that come the NBA cycle of come back around, there will be a lot of value put on guys that can actually run a team and be a traditional true point guard as all these other guys around them develop their bag to be pros and get paid to do what they do best.